Since we've all done UWP development in the past, I won't spend too long on this, but I thought a quick review was good before we demonstrate using this as one of the different types of clients we can use a web API with, right? So Universal Windows Platform, right? XAML is one way to create applications as UWP's extensible application markup language, right? Very commonly used in industry. It's a short form, really, for save you writing a lot of stuff in C# if you didn't have some kind of tool to help you design the presentation layer, right? It's similar to web forms and even the older Windows forms and so on. Actually, many tools follow this paradigm of splitting into two files, right? A code behind file and then some sort of a markup file that handles the actual the look of the page, right? And it's the same approach here, giving the opportunity to uh, separate the work, even have developers working on the back end more and or on the page behind, and graphic designers and so on doing more of the presentation work inside the markup language itself, right? As I mentioned here, it's a short form. It saves writing an awful lot of C# code if you didn't have some kind of a tool to help you design the user interface. Now, to be fair and honest, though, students tend to find it's quite quite a bit to get onto at first, and that's really because of the fact that it's universal, right? To create an app that looks good and works well on devices, everything from that huge Microsoft wall unit right down to an Xbox or a small tablet, etc. Right? It's challenging. So that's one reason why there's a fair bit of work to get up and going at first, although it gets easier as time goes on for sure, right? I mean, but it really is just markup, right? So similar to HTML in that sense, but we have attributes, we have properties, right? And things like that. So, attributes are just name value pairs, usually going in the opening tag of a tag pair, right? And then inside the opening and closing tag, we'll often have one or more properties. These are often things that are a bit more complex. You can't just easily do inside of a simple attribute assignment, right? So we have both, right? I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because this is stuff you've done before, but just as a quick example, anything that is simple, or as I like this word, indivisible, right? Usually works well as an attribute, although all attributes can be expressed as properties, and many properties can just be attributes, but often they're more complex. They're compounds. They have multiple components to them. Just a quick final note on that. Properties, of course, you can set them all in code, right? It's just a lot more work, right? Much easier to do it in the XAML itself. Okay. All right. Talking about these controls, yeah, at first glance, they look pretty intimidating at times, right? So a text block, which is really just a label in other languages, so to speak, it can be pretty simple in terms of the markup, or it can be a little bit more complex as is shown in this screenshot here, right? But all of these properties, alignments, margins, text and so on, font sizes, that's not something new. We've done that kind of work with other tools before. Now, the foreground for the text block there using a gradient brush, this is an example of why something like this would have to be done as a property. It can't be a simple uh, attribute, right? Because you've got to worry about things like start points and end points and colors and offsets and all that stuff, right? But, it's a very powerful tool. It's a little bit more work, but it's very powerful as a result. Okay, now, just in general controls, container controls contain other XAML elements. We've got two main types. Content controls, and by the way, our page itself is an example of that, right? It can contain a single content object, right? Even a button is a content control, so it can contain one object, right? So that's why you can have something like, your favorite episode of your favorite TV show playing as a video on top of a button if you want, because hey, that's legitimate content. Layout controls, on the other hand, contain a collection of child objects, right? So, and of course, each one of those can be yet another layout control and so on, right? So you can get a whole hierarchy of embedding layout controls inside other layout controls and get any kind of arrangement you want. That's one reason why you can build extremely responsive applications with this approach, right? Common layout controls, grid, stack panel, canvas, and so on, right? It's supposed to be responsive pretty much from the get-go, although if you make some of the common initial mistakes, it doesn't come out that way as you would want, right? So in terms of a bit of a summary of how we handle layout then, to make sure it's responsive, as I said earlier, the page is a content control, right? So what are we going to put as the content object on this control? Well, the most common objects are listed on the next page here, right? If I can get to it, there we go. Grid, stack panel, relative panel, scroll viewer. These are the ones that I tend to use the most. You'll notice that grid is by default when you first start a UWP project on your main page. You'll find usually a grid is the element there as the content object or content of a of the page control itself, right? Grids are great, right? They easily support responsive design. You've got different sizing options, including star sizing, which means basically use up anything that's left over, right? So it makes it, by definition, very responsive. Grids are unique in that they allow objects to overlap, right? Which can be good or bad depending on the circumstance, but you need to be aware of it, right? If you have a resolution or a screen that's just too small, things will often sit on top of each other to a certain degree. A stack panel is different, right? It's also responsive and can be used in a responsive way, but it doesn't allow overlap, right? I often tend to go for the stack panel. I mean, let me say it right off. Some developers just do everything with stack panels, pretty much, right? Having that as the content object of the page itself. Nothing wrong with that approach at all. I just find because I'm comfortable with grids, we've all been working with grid type tools. Even Bootstrap, right, uses a grid system. I'm comfortable with grids, and then I tend to use stack panels mostly to form groups of controls. So think of your typical situation. You might have a label and an input control, or a text block, maybe a text box, right? You want them side by side, kind of like a unit that you might position responsively all over the screen, depending on, resolutions and sizes and so on and so forth, right? So to define that group of controls, I find the stack panel is the way to go, right? You can have it either a vertical or horizontal orientation, right? So controls are beside each other or above each other, but then it kind of makes it a single unit that then you can have flow with the responsiveness of the page. Relative panel, it's a really interesting one. It's a situation where the placement is described relative to either other objects inside the panel or the panel itself. Like you can say centered in the panel, right? Or above or below some other object in the panel and things like that, right? So it's possible to do arrangements which just aren't possible with just the grid and stack panel on their own, right? So the relative panel is very useful for those oddball situations where nothing else will really do the job. Okay. I mentioned the scroll viewer as well. Now, I would typically not have this embedded very often. It typically is something I might put as the content object of the page itself, and then my grid inside it, right? The scroll viewer, basically, it just automatically will give you scroll bars if things, go off if there isn't room, right, to fit everything. And so that way you're guaranteed that you won't be stuck that, hey, unless I go full screen, I can't see those controls, right? Because you at least, worst case scenario, you can use the scroll bar and scroll over to it, right? So those are the ones I use the most. Let's just talk a bit in more detail about how they work. So the grid is different from some other grid controls you've probably used before, in that basically it has its own properties and attributes we might set, like backgrounds and things like that. But for the rows and columns, what we do is we give row definitions and column definitions, right? And basically, those are then properties of the grid itself. And they can have different ways of specifying heights and widths and so on, which we'll talk about more in a moment, right? So for the height and width values, we can do it hard-coded in pixels. We can use auto, which basically sets it to the size required for the largest element that it contains. Or we can use that star sizing, right? Utilizes all available space. And of course, if you have more than one column or row with star sizing, then they'll share depending on the sort of the weighting that you give them with the numeric value, right? So 1 star would give all available space, 2 star, okay, give me 2 shares, and so on and so forth, right? So if you had 6 in total and you had 3 star, then you'd get half of the available width, right? So once you get used to it, it's pretty straightforward, but you define those columns and rows first, right? Then how do you put elements inside the grid? Well, if you just stick a markup language for an element inside the grid anywhere, it will automatically go to the 0, 0 position. Now, if you haven't defined columns or rows yet, that is the whole grid. It's a single cell grid, right? But otherwise, if you want it placed in a different, other than the 0, 0, the upper left corner, then you have to specify an attached property, right? Because, grid.row, well, that's not actually a property of a button. What you're saying is this button, I'm going to attach it to the containing control, which is a grid in this case, and I'll access that containing control's row and column and set the values that I want. And that's how we define where it shows up in the grid, right? So the order that we put our elements inside this grid makes no difference for the most part, right? We define where it's placed in the grid by these attached properties. Okay, just note that of course it's always zero, right? Is the first is zero based, right? So if you had 7, for example, columns, they'd be 0 up to 6. Okay, all right. And you can set up column spans and things like that as well, right? And just remember again that the grid does allow things to sit on top of each other depending on how much room there is. Okay, now the stack panel, right, can be either vertical or horizontal. If you don't specify, you get vertical orientation. And so you can just stick things in and it will just stack them together, right? And it kind of creates a unit then or a group, which then you can have placed inside of a grid cell or wherever you want it to be, right? So it can move around the page and flow nicely when required. Okay. And again, grids do not allow, sorry, stack panels don't allow things to overlap. So they'll be stacked either beside each other or on top of each other, depending on how you've set it up. Relative panel, okay, gives us tremendous flexibility, right? But because we're describing objects in relation to the position of other objects, well, you got to be careful. It's easy to get sort of a circular reference. If I say that object A would be the left of object B, but object B thinks it's supposed to be the left of object A, well, then what's going to happen, right? So panel alignment relationships happen first, then siblings, okay, like align top with or bottom with or left with and so on, and then sibling positional relationships, left of, above, below, and so on, they come last. So that helps get rid of most of the problems that you might otherwise have with circular references. Although if you really try, you probably still could mess it up. I mean, something that I'm really good at doing once in a while, at least. Okay. Just a final tip here. Attached properties. We saw that they are properties not of the object itself, but of its container, right? So we're attaching to them. What if we want to modify them in code, right? You might think you'd do something like this. Okay, if we have some button, we go that dot grid dot row and so on, and beep, 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 beep. That's not going to work, right? So instead, there is a way we can use set value, right? So if we have that button and we want to change what row it's in dynamically, maybe we were having something else show up in the grid and we want to move or rearrange things, then we can set value, then we pass in what attached property we want to set, and then the value we're going to give it, right? So pretty straightforward, but it is something that's a little different from what you might have thought in terms of how it works in code. So there's a lot to extensible application markup language, right? And it's great to get started and learn as much as you can. So we'll do some demos to help refresh our memory on all this stuff as well.